Jefferson "Soapy" Smith, the con man who ruled an entire town. He sold a bar of soap for $1,200. That was the moment Jefferson Randolph "Soapy" Smith realized he had found his calling, standing on a street corner in Denver in 1879, watching a mark hand over more money than most men earned in a year for a cake of soap wrapped in a dollar bill. The man had been convinced, absolutely certain, that his particular bar contained a $100 note instead. It did not. It contained exactly $1, same as all the others. But Soapy had made him believe, and belief was worth more than gold. Jefferson Smith was born in Georgia in 1860 to a respectable family that fell apart during the Civil War. His father had been a lawyer before the war, reduced him to subsistence farming and bitterness. His mother died when Jefferson was 12, and his father followed 2 years later, leaving the boy to make his way in a world that had little use for Southern orphans with no money and no prospects. Jefferson drifted west like so many others, working odd jobs, learning the angles, discovering he had a gift. He could talk. More than that, he could make people believe whatever he told them. He had a face that inspired trust, handsome in a rough way with clear blue eyes and a ready smile. He dressed well, always clean and pressed, projecting an image of prosperity and respectability that made marks lower their guard. The soap scam was brilliantly simple. Soapy would set up on a busy street corner with a case of ordinary soap bars. In front of the crowd, he would wrap some of the bars with paper money. Ones, fives, tens, 20s, even the occasional $100 bill. Then he would wrap all the bars in plain paper so they looked identical and mix them together. He would sell them for $5 each, and people would line up, convinced they might get the bar with the 100. What the marks did not know was that Soapy had shills planted in the crowd, members of his gang who would buy soap bars, unwrap them, and loudly celebrate finding $20 or $50. This would whip the crowd into a frenzy, and people would fight to buy bars. But the real money-wrapped bars never went to actual customers. Through sleight of hand and careful arrangement, Soapy made sure only his shills got the good bars. Everyone else got plain soap with a single dollar bill. The scam made Soapy wealthy, but more importantly, it made him famous in the underworld. Other con men wanted to work with him. Criminals sought his protection. By 1880, Soapy had assembled a gang of grifters, pickpockets, and strong-arm men who worked the streets of Denver under his leadership. But Soapy Smith was not content to be just another successful con man. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted power, real power, the kind that came from controlling not just money but people, institutions, entire communities. And he found his opportunity in the wild frontier towns, where law was thin and greed was thick. His operation expanded beyond the soap scam. He ran rigged gambling houses where the cards were marked and the dice were loaded. He operated shell games on street corners where no mark ever picked the right shell. He ran fake lottery operations, investment schemes, and land frauds. His gang would rob drunks in alleys, pick pockets in crowds, and run protection rackets on legitimate businesses. What made Soapy different from other criminal bosses was his genius for public relations. He donated to churches and charities. He helped poor families pay for funerals. He organized food drives for the destitute. He made sure newspapers wrote about his generosity, building a reputation as a Robin Hood figure, even as his gang was robbing the town blind. In Denver, Soapy's gang became so powerful that they effectively controlled entire neighborhoods. Police were bribed or intimidated. Politicians took his money and looked the other way. Anyone who complained too loudly found themselves framed for crimes they did not commit, or simply beaten and driven out of town. But Denver's civic leaders eventually had enough. Reform movements began to push back against the corruption. Newspapers started investigating Soapy's operations. Police raids became more frequent and less easily bought off. By 1892, Soapy realized Denver was becoming too hot, too civilized, too difficult to control. So he went looking for a new frontier, a place where civilization was even thinner and opportunities even greater. He found it in Creede, Colorado, a silver mining boomtown that had exploded from nothing to 10,000 people in a matter of months. Creede was chaos incarnate. Miners flooded in seeking fortune. Businesses sprang up overnight. There was no real law, no established power structure, just thousands of men with money to spend and dreams to chase. It was perfect. Soapy arrived in Creede in March 1892 with his gang and immediately set up operations. Within weeks, he controlled most of the gambling in town. Within months, he had his people in positions throughout the business community. He opened a saloon called the Orleans Club that became the center of his empire. But Soapy's real innovation in Creede was the rig. He convinced legitimate business owners to install false fronts, gambling operations, auction houses, real estate offices that appeared legitimate but were actually elaborate cons designed to separate miners from their money. A miner would sell his claim for thousands of dollars, walk into what he thought was a respectable investment office, and walk out hours later broke, convinced he had made legitimate business deals that simply went bad. Soapy's gang worked every angle. They ran fake assay offices that undervalued legitimate ore samples and bought them cheap. They operated rigged poker games in the back rooms of legitimate saloons. They sold fake mining claims and worthless stock certificates. They rolled drunks, picked pockets, and ran protection rackets. And through it all, Soapy maintained his public image as a civic-minded businessman and generous philanthropist. When a prominent citizen needed help, Soapy was there with money and support. When disaster struck, Soapy organized relief efforts. He made sure everyone knew that Jefferson Smith was a pillar of the community. The reality was that Soapy and his gang were systematically looting Creede. Estimates suggest they took over $500,000 out of the town in less than a year, an astronomical sum for the time. But the silver played out faster than anyone expected, and by late 1892, Creede was already dying. Time to move on. Soapy spent the next few years bouncing between towns, running his operations, always staying one step ahead of reform movements and law enforcement. Then, in 1897, he heard about the Klondike Gold Rush. Thousands of prospectors were flooding into Skagway, Alaska, on their way to the gold fields. It was the biggest opportunity Soapy had ever seen. Skagway in 1897 was even more lawless than Creede had been. It was not even officially part of the United States yet. Alaska was still a vague territory with almost no federal presence. The town had exploded from nothing to over 10,000 people, all of them desperate to get to the Klondike, all of them carrying whatever money they had scraped together for the journey. Soapy arrived in Skagway with his best men and immediately set up the most ambitious criminal operation of his career. He did not just want to control the underworld, he wanted to control the entire town. Within months, Soapy had achieved exactly that. He installed his men in key positions. His gang ran most of the saloons, the gambling halls, the hotels. He created fake telegraph offices where prospectors would send messages home, not knowing the messages never went anywhere, and the replies they received were written by Soapy's men. He operated protection rackets on every legitimate business. He controlled the docks where supplies came in. Soapy even created his own unofficial government. He organized a law and order committee, staffed entirely by his men. He held public meetings where he gave speeches about civic responsibility and proper conduct. He positioned himself as the de facto mayor of Skagway, the man who kept order and made things run smoothly. The reality was far darker. Prospectors were robbed systematically and ruthlessly. Men would arrive in Skagway with life savings, pass through Soapy's network of cons and rigged games and leave broke or not leave at all. Some victims simply disappeared, their bodies presumably dumped in the wilderness or the water. Soapy's gang operated with complete impunity. They beat people in the streets. They extorted businesses. They ran elaborate cons that sometimes took days to execute, slowly draining victims of everything they had. The few legitimate lawmen in town were either on Soapy's payroll or too intimidated to act. But Soapy made critical mistakes in Skagway. He had become too arrogant, too visible, too convinced of his own invincibility, and he had not accounted for the fact that some men cannot be intimidated or bought. The breaking point came on July the 7th, 1898. A prospector named John Douglas Stewart returned from the Klondike with nearly $3,000 in gold dust. He was immediately targeted by Soapy's gang and lured into a rigged card game. By the time Stewart realized he had been cheated, his gold was gone and Soapy's men had scattered. Stewart went to the legitimate citizens of Skagway, the business owners and residents who had been suffering under Soapy's rule, but had been too disorganized or frightened to resist. This time was different. Stewart's robbery in broad daylight, the brazenness of it, finally pushed people past their breaking point. A group of armed citizens formed what they called the Committee of 101, a vigilante organization dedicated to taking back Skagway from Soapy Smith and his gang. They held a meeting to discuss what to do, and word reached Soapy that the citizens were planning to run him out of town. Soapy had faced down opposition before. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble, to bribe or intimidate his way to safety. But he was drunk that evening, angry and reckless, convinced that his reputation and his guns would be enough. He grabbed his rifle and marched down to the wharf where the Committee of 101 was meeting. He was confronted by 4 men guarding the entrance to the meeting, led by a surveyor and engineer named Frank Reed. The confrontation lasted less than a minute. Words were exchanged. Soapy raised his rifle. Frank Reed drew his pistol. Both men fired. Soapy's shot went wild. Reed's bullet struck Soapy in the heart. Jefferson Smith fell to the ground and died within minutes, bleeding out on the Skagway wharf at the age of 38. Frank Reed was also hit in the exchange and would die from his wounds 12 days later, but he had ended Soapy Smith's reign. The Committee of 101 moved immediately. Soapy's gang was rounded up, arrested, or driven out of town. His operations were shut down. His property was seized. Within 24 hours, Skagway had been transformed from a criminal haven to a relatively law-abiding community. Soapy Smith's body was buried in the Skagway Cemetery with a simple wooden marker. Frank Reed was buried with full honors as the man who saved Skagway, his grave marked with an impressive stone monument that read, "He gave his life for the honor of Skagway." The contrast between the two graves became symbolic of the story itself. The con man who tried to rule through deception and violence, buried in disgrace, versus the honest man who stood up to tyranny and paid the ultimate price, honored as a hero. But Soapy Smith's legacy was more complicated than simple villainy. He had been a criminal, certainly, a con man and a thief who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars and ruined countless lives. But he had also been a genius at organization, at public relations, at understanding how power actually worked in frontier towns where official law was weak or absent. He had proven that in the right circumstances, with the right skills and the right ruthlessness, one man could control an entire community through nothing more than confidence, connections, and carefully applied violence. He had shown that the line between legitimate power and criminal enterprise could be remarkably thin, that respectability could be purchased and authority could be manufactured. In the years after his death, Soapy Smith became a legend of the Old West, his exploits growing in the telling. Some stories painted him as a charming rogue, a gentleman bandit who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Others portrayed him more accurately as a ruthless crime boss who built an empire on fraud and intimidation. The truth was somewhere in between. Soapy was undeniably a criminal who caused real harm to real people. But he was also a product of his time and place, a man who exploited the lawless chaos of frontier boomtowns to build something unique, a criminal organization that masqueraded so successfully as legitimate authority that for years most people could not tell the difference. The photograph of Soapy in his saloon, surrounded by his men, dressed in his fine suit with his characteristic confidence, captures something essential about the man. He looks like a respectable businessman, a community leader, someone you could trust. And that was always his greatest con, making people believe he was something other than what he truly was. He sold a bar of soap for $1,200, and from that moment he understood that belief was the most valuable commodity in the West. For nearly 20 years he sold that belief to thousands of people, convincing them that legitimate opportunity existed where there was only fraud, that he was a respectable citizen when he was a criminal mastermind, that Skagway was a well-ordered town when it was actually his personal fiefdom. In the end, a single bullet ended what law and reform movements had failed to stop for decades. But the story of Soapy Smith lived on, a reminder that in the Wild West, the most dangerous outlaws were not always the ones with the fastest guns, but the ones with the smoothest words and the most convincing smiles.